Yes, no, I will introduce the seminar. And once again, thanks to everyone that has made time to come join us today. My name is Andres Mutagu. I'm one of the facilitators for this webinar series. And we are celebrating the LGBTIQ plus community through this series. It's a series that's running from July until the end of August. And today we have Samuel Matsikure, and he will be looking at queer history and politics from many regions. Like his topic is on queer history and politics from many regions have inspired and influenced our African queer politics over the years. So he'll be looking at queer politics from a Zimbabwean perspective. And about Samuel Matsikure is a human rights activist, a program manager at GALZ, GALZ, and an LGBTI association in Zimbabwe. He has vast experience in program monitoring, human rights, and sexual and reproductive health. He's also a counselor with great experience working with individual groups, couples, and families. Specializes in sex and sexuality, relationship, and marital issues. A holder of Bachelor of Science, honors degree in sociology and gender development, a diploma in systematic family therapy with Zimbabwean Institute of Systematic Therapy, a master's degree in human rights, peace, and development with African University 2021, a 2016 human rights advocate, alumni with Columbia University, NYC, USA. Samuel, it gives us, and we're really honored to have you participating in this webinar. And I wait to hear more about what you have for us on this special topic. To everyone else that have just joined us and those that are going to join us, welcome to the Center for Civil Society. We have simple house rules for the center. We'll give to speak. And for all the guests, can you please be muted? Preferably have your videos also muted. Once the speaker and Danford are done with the session, we'll then take Q&A at the end and have a discussion. Once again, welcome to the Center for Civil Society. And some more. Dan, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Andres. My line is very bad. I hope you can hear me on your side. Thank you, Samuel, for joining us. We are going to give you close to 30 minutes to 40 minutes, and you share your experiences with queer politics or queer movements in Zimbabwe, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And can you, everyone, may you please mute your mics and shut your videos. And if you need to engage with the speaker during the Q&A session, please do that by showing us the virtual hand, and then we'll recognize you. Thank you so much, Samuel, for joining us. You can start your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Excuse my voice, I'm recovering from a cold. But otherwise, I'm excited to have a discussion with you, just perhaps going through the history of the LGBTI movement in Zimbabwe, some of the pitfalls that we have encountered in the movement, but also some of the gains that we have had and where we are at today in terms of the queer movement. I'll be speaking from a GALZ lens because there has been some changes in the last 10 years, where we've also seen young emerging organizations that are also focusing on different communities of LGBTI persons. And a lot of these organizations, I'm excited also to see that happening, because for many years, GALZ was the only organization that was focusing on LGBTIQ issues. which in a way was quite a bit challenging when you have to try and address and give perhaps space or services for quite a diverse group of people within limited resources, of course. But now having more emerging groups, it also helps us as GALZ perhaps to refocus on certain things that we feel are quite pertinent in the movement, especially when it comes to policy and law reform. You know, it's quite a mammoth task to try and put the queer movement in a context like Zimbabwe, which has gone on for almost 30 years of trying to change the space and the environment. But what I found quite interesting, even as an activist, as a gay man living in Zimbabwe all this time, but also working with GALZ team and those that have also gone through the organization and out of it, some of it whom we have lost during the course of the struggle, like Keith Goddard and others who are also staying in diaspora, who have also contributed to the movement, to try and submit it into a 30 minutes presentation, but I'll do my best. And in Zimbabwe, when you look at the history of queer movement, it did not actually start during independence. There is a lot of history that is prior to that, where different gay and lesbian women were self-organizing in different spaces. Although by law, it was also quite a difficult space to be because it was still criminalized under the criminal codification and also given the Dutch law that introduced some of these provisions. But come to independence, a lot of the groups that were operating underground were predominantly white, and the Black community was quite invisible. And I remember coming out around 1990, where I encountered a few Black people that were organizing safe spaces to interact. And in meeting these people, I actually met them through what we used to call Parade magazine. You know, we all have come from a space where we had pen pals. And today, of course, a lot of people interact through different social media platforms that are available. But at the time, a lot of us were meeting through magazines. And what I realized at that time was that a lot of the people that were quite open who would meet in the middle of the city were people coming from the periphery of the city. Places, for instance, in Harare, we have a place called Epworth. There was quite a vibrant group of activists, and one of them was Mike, and people who used to call Mike Mother. So all gay people who would come out and come to the city, some of them staying on the streets, gave Mike the respect that he deserved as a mother who would take care of them and move them to Epworth and stay with him as a whole group of people, because that was a way of looking out for each other. But there were also people that were learned, that also were part of the community, that will also come into those spaces that most of the time was also organized by the white community. And with that in mind, there wasn't anything or anyone thinking about challenging the law or policy of Zimbabwe. It was more around organizing social spaces. And the first groups that actually formed the movement were actually lesbian women who came together and formed a space where they were able to meet, which was called the Monday Night or the Women's Cultural Club. And this club, of course, fell apart. And I think this is where the self-organizing of social spaces came into fruition. And half the time people will meet in places like Time and Place, which was a club. We also have the golf clubs in Harare that people would also meet just to dance the night away. And GALZ sort of started coming into place because what then happened was that people started dying of HIV beyond just the social spaces that we were organizing. And there was a panic from the community to also think about how do we respond to that. And the second one was that the Black community was also growing and integrating within the white spaces that were organized. And what that entailed was that there was need for us to find ways of trying to coordinate the social spaces. So there was need for somebody to come up with a flyer and let people know that the Thursday nights are on, or the Friday nights, or this Saturday we are meeting at this venue and that venue. But of course, within that group of people, there was also still segregation. And I think coming from a colonial legacy, these were things that were expected. Because for some of us who were Black, we were considered to be people that were coming into a space where we were considered poor, didn't have resources, are likely to get into blackmail and extortion towards white people. So sometimes there were spaces where you get people charging you for an entry to try and keep the Black, gay, bisexual men or trans people out of that space. And I think that tension went on for some time, and that segregation also came about. But I think people realized that there were certain commonalities that we had as a collective, which was that we couldn't enjoy these freedoms freely in the spaces that we're engaging or places that we were meeting. And as Black community, we'll sometimes also congregate in our own spaces and have conversations about what our future looks like or looked like. And of course, we didn't even understand things like there's the criminal law codification that says you shouldn't, be getting into affairs. Those were things that were not in our minds at the time. But what was interesting for me personally was that at one point I came across a drum magazine which had Simon Nkoli wearing I think it was a costume that had boobs on it, walking in the streets, which was the first Pride in South Africa. And my first thoughts were that perhaps I should go to South Africa where I can find more of these people and I can be normal. And we actually passed around this drum magazine for a long time among friends because it had lots of pictures and articles of the first Pride in South Africa. And our dream at that time was that we'll also have a Pride in Zimbabwe like that. We had that dream at the time. And we then started seeing GALZ coming into formation around 1988. And the first person that gave GALZ a space to operationalize a way of coordinating the social spaces, if I recall, was Lynn Francis. Lynn Francis was a white woman who later on became the champion for HIV in Zimbabwe. She kept a lot of us alive during the time when there was no treatment available for HIV. She gave GALZ her cottage, which was in the suburb of Milton Park, which is where GALZ is situated today. And in that cottage, it allowed people to print these flyers, but it also gave an opportunity for the community to self-organize and perhaps create what then became our counselors. And this pool of counselors were people that then started helping those that were testing HIV positive. And of course, some of them also tested positive. So the strength and the backbone of where GALZ is today, a lot of it is also anchored among champions who survived the plague in the 90s and people who survived without the medication that we have the privilege of taking today. They would go out and visit people who were in the homes and see if they can provide them with nutritional support, mental health, giving them a good diet, because this is what was then recommended at the time. A lot of people survived on good diet. There were no tablets. Also learning to manage stress, introducing your spiritual side, whatever that is, to stay sane in a time when the disease was considered to be a gay plague. And a lot of the people in our communities actually started stigmatizing these people. But of course, coming to the book fair crisis in 1995, there had been a lot of self-organizing information that had happened. And that came with GALZ becoming a membership organization. And in the organization at the time, there were different categories of membership. If you had, for instance, a white tag, it means you were paying members, you were a paid member, someone who has actually paid the membership. And then we also had the yellow and the green. You had people who had the green, who had someone who had sponsored their membership. So sometimes you get well-wishers who would say, I'm pledging my money for you to support 5 more people to become members, especially from the Black community. And that helped to build the diversity that we saw in Zimbabwe at the time. But come the book fair, it created a whole focus on issues that perhaps were not so visible to the public. Because at the time, GALZ then applied for a stand at the book fair. And at the time, the theme for that book fair was human rights. And we thought, well, this is a human rights issue because globally, the discourse around rights of LGBTI persons had started. A lot of us had witnessed the movements across Europe and America that were also coming out. Some of it we're not seeing much on the TV because a lot of us didn't have televisions at home. But there were magazines that were available that we could access from friends and share among ourselves. And sometimes you take a page out because there's a hank there, but we also read what it meant to actually have information that there were also people that were like us. But of course, what also came out of the book fair is perhaps the well-known statement that LGBTI persons are Western dogs. Because at the time of the book fair, the late Robert Mugabe, who was the president at the time, was actually the guest of honor at the book fair. And of course, GALZ did not back out. It went to the courts to challenge the position that had been taken by the book fair. And GALZ won. So for the next coming 5 to 10 years, the book fair became our torch as a movement to create visibility. And interestingly enough, Black community members are the ones who started standing at the book fair without fear and wanted to challenge the discourse that this was a white man's disease, because in the newspapers prior to the book fair, we had seen articles that says white men are, seducing our Black boys and abusing them into homosexuality and so on. We also wanted to show that there are also Black bisexual men, gay men, lesbians in our community, and we are part of their agenda. But in a way, they also responded to that. They placed homosexuality as a national agenda. So everything that you see today in Zimbabwe in terms of homophobia, the stigma, the continuous disregard of rights of LGBTI persons is anchored on a national agenda that was actually formed and structured to oppress the visibility and the rights of LGBTI persons in Zimbabwe. This came in different form. There was a lot of political rhetoric, and every platform that a politician will speak, they'll denounce homosexuality and gay people in Zimbabwe. We also saw the directive to the media, state media houses, that they had to report anything and everything negative about LGBTI persons. And in 1995, the Parliament of Zimbabwe actually fully endorsed an anti-gay campaign. And this was taken to people who didn't even understand the issues, but also to those who were curious at the time, because when we were coming out, a lot of the times people were actually curious to know what is gay, who are you, and so on. It wasn't an issue. Zimbabweans didn't have an issue on homosexuality, but because of the anti-gay campaign that came into the public, it became an issue. And of course, the former Prime Minister's case of Sodindo Banana did not also help, because in 1997, he was brought to the courts for abuse of power and position because of a former, perhaps partner or friend who had killed somebody And then in his defense, he said, I killed somebody because the former head of state was sodomizing me. And of course, Banana lost the case because the state indicated that there was no discrimination at the time on the basis that he was a man. And then homosexuality became a pariah in Zimbabwe. And of course, you also saw that along the way, the anti-gay campaign was taken overboard, even when we look at the process of 2010, when the preparation for the constitution-making process was taking place. The media itself embarked on a very negative public campaign, and you could see it from different newspaper headlines at the time, where it says homosexuality destroys and curses the nation. You had someone saying, Chief says gays have no place in our constitution. You also had people or newspapers like the Sunday Mail who would say Sodom is a disgrace to Zim society and culture and so on. And they even called the LGBTI community or the lesbians and gays at the time to come and speak why they felt they needed to be in the constitution. And they were brave enough to go and speak out. And this came out on national TV. But of course, there was a lot of ridiculing and haggling from the then members of parliament. And where does this come from when we look at the history of Zimbabwe? A lot of it is embedded from our own culture and to some extent religion, because when we look and trace back our culture, people always consider homosexuality to be very un-African. But our history, of course, said otherwise, because we do have rock paintings in Zimbabwe of the Khoisan where they depicted same-sex practices. And because we come from a culture that is a culture of silence, a lot of data and information related to same-sex relations and practices is not quite available. There is a dearth of information in that area. And we do see a few cases that were done in the 60s, for instance, where people were brought to court, or even in the 1800s, where certain cases were either brought to the courts or to the chief's court, but was not considered homosexual. Because in our culture, boys sometimes play when they are herding cattle, whether they have anal sex or whatever sex, they do mutual masturbation. And so these are things that were common and are common when boys are herding cattle. But of course, when it comes to the age of marriage, you are expected to get married. And at times in our culture, when you have come of age and you're married, the aunties of the family are consulted to help you to get married. And sometimes they actually impose a lady on you or a woman on you if they find you are not interested in any of the girls around or are interested in women at all. And I think that sort of helped to cover people perhaps who have a different sexual orientation. And when also you were not sexually active in the home, the wife would go and complain to the aunties. And if there were issues to do with, for instance, erectile dysfunction in the marriage, in our culture, we also have what we call kupindira. They will organize that perhaps your younger brother will go in and impregnate your wife on your behalf. Or at times, they'll actually call what we call anasawira. These are your close-knitted family, because extended family in our culture is important. But you also need to look at the lens of sexuality. In our context, sex is seen as something you do for procreation. And before independence, you find that Shona people, for instance, would laugh at you if you just want to indulge into pleasurable sex and not procreation. Because this was part of a culture. And in the part of being part of a culture, it's important in the African or in the Shona culture, for instance, where I come from, to understand that family lineage is important. So your choice is expected that you are supposed to seed and have kids or have family. Failure to do that, you are an outcast. You're shunned upon and things like that. And if it was a woman, they would also do the same. You're either forced into marriage or bestowed into someone. And if you don't want to be sexually active, at times people were raped for them to conceive and have a child. But of course, with that in mind, you find that Shona people, or in Zimbabwe, people cannot fathom that two men can actually then have a relationship when sex is supposed to be between a man and a woman to procreate. And I think with the coming of Christianity, that was sort of reinforced. But of course, you also need to understand that Christianity also brought shame to a culture where perhaps certain practices were seen as tolerated. For instance, if someone was caught engaging into then what is called sodomy today in our culture, they were asked to pay 1 cow as a fine for engaging into that. But if you were caught indulging into adultery, you were expected to pay 6 cows. So it shows that the severity of homosexuality at the time was something that was not seen as severe or a crime that was, quite severe compared to adultery. But of course, people lack that understanding of our culture. That's why you find that the homosexuality in Zimbabwe became very political. It was politicized to a point where at every political space, campaign, even when Mugabe was at the United Nations, or he's going to have an opportunity to speak while he's burying somebody at the Heroes Acre, he would bring everything and all guns out around denouncing homosexuality. And what that entails is also grounded not only in our politics, but also in our economy. GALZ was fighting for recognition and our economy was going down. We experienced ISAP, which is structural adjustment program that took a lot of the men out of their jobs. And there was a lot of grumbling from the public about the state of our affairs with our economy, which we are still struggling today. And given the culture where we come from of either suspicion, a culture that is also ingrained in rituals, a culture that perceives certain practices as bringing a curse to the country, you find that even the failure of our economy was blamed on the gays. The failure of our country not getting rains over the years is blamed on the gays. So the issue around economic issues and also what was happening between Zimbabwe and other states, especially the Americans and so on, issues around imperialism also came into play. So the government was also saying that, some of these alien rights are being brought to us to destabilize Zimbabwe, but also as a way of imperialism. And he was then supported by church leaders who also preached negatively on homosexuality. We had, for instance, Professor Ezekiel Guti, the founder of Forward in Faith Church. We also then had the Anglican saga with Kunonga, who also brought the issue of homosexuality in the discourse. But what I found quite interesting in all these narratives and the negativities that was happening in Zimbabwe is that the LGBTI community in Zimbabwe and the activists were relentless and were quite resilient, because we continued to occupy safe spaces by creating partnerships with people who could provide spaces for us to engage in our conversations and our politics. We had hotels, we had lodges, we had individuals' homes, and that also resulted in GALZ being constantly raided. And with the ratings that were coming in, it also continued to create fear among others in the community who then were hesitant to access services or to be in GALZ spaces. But GALZ also challenged some of those raids. We had some raids in 2011 where we were being accused of also speaking against the state, because that's when GALZ launched its first human rights violations book. And they wanted to know what was in there. So we also have a celebration today, and in this coming few days, where we are celebrating the 44 that were arrested on the day, who we see as champions who were resilient, because not only were they locked up, they were stepped on, they were asked to slap each other violently, they were followed to their homes and outed. It means a lot of people lost their homes and families at the time. And following up to that, we also had raids where we are being accused of keeping pornographic materials or dealing in drugs. But all these cases, they found, or they came to nothing. But we took them to court and we won most of these cases. And in a space like Zimbabwe, where in constant politics, these issues are constantly raised, because they said, not only is it an African, but in Zimbabwe, traditional leaders who are gatekeepers would say, if you found any gay person in your village, you can take their land. And this is something that was also reinforced by the current head of state, that if anyone who is LGBTI has land or benefited from the land, it should be taken. So that also affected issues that we started seeing in our communities. There were high rates of blackmail and extortion from the public, but also from state security. There were police officers who would connive with individuals to come and demand and extort people of their property, of their resources. We have people that lost millions of dollars in property. And GALZ also then decided that we needed to introduce a legal team that is able to respond to that. So we have people like Professor Mark Altman, who was there to respond to all and advise GALZ on different legal cases. And that was quite strategic, because given the backlash that we were getting from state, we needed to be also proactive. But of course, the backlash we continued to get pushed us into a corner where it was now difficult for us to be so visible in many spaces, the clubs that I've spoken about earlier, or even just congregating. And we had to reevaluate our approach. So one of the things that we ended up doing was also find space within the HIV space. So a lot of the work that GALZ has done and other partners over the years, you find a lot of it is grounded in HIV, because that's the only space that sort of remained open for us. But it also gave us a platform to continue to voice and demand our rights as citizens. And it took more than 20 years for our government to even come up with one national program. So for the 20 years, many of us who are HIV positive survived. We survived on well wishers. We survived on people like Lynn Francis. We survived from external doctors that were coming in every 6 months with supply for those that had started treatment when drugs came into the picture, because it was costly for people to access drugs and who didn't have money, because they were being charged in US dollars, and a lot of people who were positive were quite poor. So we needed to find space where we continue to have these conversations. But given my theme today, how did we manage to decolonize, or how do we continue to decolonize the queer movement in Zimbabwe? One of the things that we consciously did as a community was that we needed to make sure that we have a Black face to our movement. Because in a context like Zimbabwe, where the Black majority were saying we needed to kick out the white minority, coming from our history of colonialism and fighting that and getting independence, we needed to claim our land. It means that white farmers lost their land, and we needed to harness the power and our resources. And that also created fear among the white community who were LGBTI persons. So they also withdrew from the organization. I remember the first LGBT, the first board meeting where we were also trying to get the leadership into the structures of GALZ from the Black community. And what that did was that we had a whole revamp of the board with Black people sitting at the helm of the organization. And that also assisted us in making sure that the visibility and identity of our discourse is driven by the Black community. The second thing is that we consciously also continue to push issues by referring them back to our own ways of living and culture. And one of the things is also referring what does the culture of silence mean when it comes to sexuality issues in our community. And what we unraveled is that our traditional leaders and chiefs would say, we've always had people who are gay, bisexual, or lesbian in our communities, but as a society, we had a way of dealing with these things. That's why things like Pindira were there. That's why things like bestowing a wife to somebody because they are failing to propose was there. But also, we also had to make sure that somebody procreates, and when they've done that, they turn a blind eye to anything else that they'll do, or what they do when they are heading cattle. What has only changed today is that we are asking for rights, and the rights that a lot of people rush to is that they want to get married. But also we needed to continue to use the language, because part of the language that we use to date is very westernized. And with that in mind, people always continue to refer that this is a Western disease. This was imposed to us pre-colonialism or post-colonialism. These things were white man's disease. So when we use words like lesbian, gay, bisexual, and so on, they become very Eurocentric, they become very Western, and so on. So what sort of words were used in our culture? When you look at the Shona or the Ndebele, they have Esteban or Ngochan, some of these names came about, of course, as people were moving into the mines, and there were certain practices that men who were living in the mines were doing to keep themselves perhaps sane, but also they didn't bring their wives to the space. But in our culture, sometimes we don't have one way to explain anything. So in our Shona culture, if you have an aunt perhaps who had certain men characteristics, we would call it the auntie of the family. The auntie of the family can be very masculine, can do men's jobs, and so on. So that helps to relate some of the things that we are trying to explain when then we unpack what LGBTI is. Or we had words like Jengawakadzi. It's a man who usually wants to spend time in the women's company constantly, even when they are growing up. They're always with women. They like to do women's stuff. And half the time they consider these things that maybe someone will outgrow them. But half the time people do not outgrow them. They always say, uyu, ane shairech rume, or ane shairech kads. It means they are possessed by a woman's spirit or a man's spirit. That's why they act the way they do. So we have this language that we need to use and harness so that we decolonize the movement. But also to really unpack the current laws that not only were they imposed on us because of what was happening within the African settings, within different parts of Zimbabwe, because the laws that we currently see, the draconian laws that we continue to suffer from, like the criminal codification or the sodomy laws, were imposed by colonial masters. And if as a country and countries, we are changing these by embedding or renewing our constitutions and crafting our own laws, why can't we craft them in a way that is inclusive? Because when we talk about Ubuntu in our culture, Ubuntu builds and protects even the most vulnerable, whichever mechanisms you can use. And I've already indicated some of those mechanisms that we're used in our culture to protect people that could have been perceived at the time as either Ngochani or Esteban, or people who had a certain behavior that was considered to be abnormal in some way or the other. But the world has evolved. We are saying we understand that there are rights. and individuals have to be protected and have a choice to make based on that. And we also looked at the issues around a lot of men who continue to create some of these laws, because our societies, including Zimbabwe, are very patriarchal. It's also men who create these laws, but also indulge into same-sex sexuality in the night or where they are not seen, for one reason or the other. So self-stigma is a critical issue that we continue to see. But where we are today, the movement has grown because in the last 10 years, we have seen the formation of new organizations. We have organizations like Sexual Rights Center, Zimbabwe Intersex Rise in Zimbabwe. We have RAWO, we have Pakasipiti, which is an LGBTQ organization. We have organizations that are led by resilient trans women. We also have sex workers within our midst. And a lot of these organizations, while they are responding more to the demand for ending HIV in our midst, one of the things we should not forget is that there's still the queer politics. Because a lot of us, we are more than our sexuality. And one of the things we continue to champion, when we now zero back to why GALZ is today, is that our strategic plan in the next 5 years focuses on economic empowerment and development of our communities. The same way we've used the HIV to integrate our issues and change policies and see national programs coming to fruition and people accessing services. The question is, why can't we get into the business sector as well and do the same? Because we need to normalize that our people are found in any company, at any market, in any business sector that you can think of. But we also need to continuously deal with the social aspect of it. The public discourse on these issues in Zimbabwe, as difficult as it may be, it has really changed in the last couple of years. We see more people talking about LGBTI people in different platforms and not being so negative. Because a lot of times you would ask somebody, why do you hate gay people? And they'll say, well, these are the things that Mugabe said we don't want. But then what is your own opinion? And someone starts, chewing their tongue in the process because they have not really thought about it. And those sort of spaces we are gaining, it's important that we balance law reform and also social transformation at the community level. Having parents and friends that are coming to our spaces and speaking out is quite critical, because the current constitution of Zimbabwe is a tool that we need to put into practice and constitutionalize it by practically using it. As much as it does not protect LGBTI by mentioning sexual orientation, it also gives us opportunities, because one of the things that it says is that no one of age should be forced into marriage, but everyone has a right to find a family. But it goes further and says same-sex marriage is prohibited. Perhaps it's also acknowledging that I might have a marriage, but at this moment in time, I cannot get married. But it also goes further to say there's a provision for non-discrimination. And it also bestows all other rights to Zimbabwean citizens. It doesn't say heterosexual citizens. It says all citizens of Zimbabwe in all our diversity. We should be protected by this. So there has been some changes that we continue to see. If you recall recently, when the new government came into play in 2017, the current head of state was asked if he will change any laws with regards to LGBTI persons. And he says, well, currently I'll respect what the current constitution says. But for those who want to advocate for those rights can continue to do so. Until then, and when Zimbabwe says we can change the laws, you'll be open to that. And I think that has also given us an opportunity to expand our scope and space in terms of engagement beyond just the health sector, but looking at issues around business. But we also want to empower our communities, looking at issues around litigation and legal reform. So we're also continuously reviewing and revisiting some of the cases that we are seeing to date, but also looking at violations that continue to occur in our communities and challenge that within the courts of law. That is also something that we have committed ourselves to do for the next 5 years. But we also need to continuously build the resilience of our communities, because for GALZ to be celebrating almost 32 years of its formation, the resilience is not about us, the activists, or those, some of us who can eloquently speak. It's the people who are LGBTI in Zimbabwe who have kept these organizations going. The people that continue to say, we are with you. The people that continue to bear the brand of violence, exclusion, and discrimination in Zimbabwe, and who have stayed fast to say we will change our country because we only have one country and we only have one citizenship. And these are the things that we'll continue to do and are committed as a community. If we look at the queer movement in Europe, it took more than 50 years. So in Zimbabwe, we are not far. Some of us may not enjoy the fruits of what we are doing, but there's change with the future generation. I'll rest it here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel, for giving us such a comprehensive, talk on, the queer politics, its evolution, and, taking us back to pre-colonial Africa and also in post-colonial Zimbabwe. And you sort of track how, attitudes have always been there, or acceptance that, the queer people will always be amongst us as African community. So I've got a couple of questions here. And I liked the discourse of Zvekumombe. I really liked that theorization. So there is a question, the first question, the main opposition parties, that is the MDC Alliance and the newly formed CCC, have reserved their comments on incorporating queer rights into the Zim constitution. How much faith do you have in the opposition when it comes to advancing queer rights? And another question, what other platforms besides the Zim Book Fair is GALZ used to promote queer rights in Zimbabwe, and how effective are they?
Okay. So with your first question, do we have any confidence in the opposition? Not at all. As much as they claim to be very democratic and human rights best, they failed to convince me that they can do anything for the LGBTI community. At least with the current ruling party, you know what their position is, and they're quite clear about it. And that gives us an opportunity to engage from what they know and what they understand about these issues. With the opposition, they've always dilly-dally on the position and not quite clear about it. Reason being, they also don't want to lose the votes. So it's about the votes. So I'm not really confident that at the moment, they are quite on our side. And I have not seen that response, because when you look at 2010, when we had the 2018, when we had the elections, GALZ wrote to about 15 political parties, asking 5 questions around issues around good governance, LGBTI rights, access to health, and so on. We only got 3 responses. The first response was from the ruling party, ZANU-PF. The second one was from Joyce Mjuri's party. And the third one, I can't remember what other party was. And the rest did not respond. They say, we'll get back to you. And what ZANU-PF did at the time was they invited us and say, we want to hear what your concerns were. And we tabled what our experience had been during Mugabe's time. As much as they continue to say we're a very conservative government, we'll leave you to do your work and so on, but at least we understand where they stand. The 2CC and MDC have not said anything, and I'm not convinced that I can be comfortable. Until they're able to do so, then I'll change my mind. In terms of the queer rights spaces that we've used, currently, as I sit here with the LGBTI community in Zimbabwe, we are now able to call members of parliament to a meeting and have a caucus. So we have been engaging members of parliament from both parties. In the initial years, it was difficult to get people from the ruling party during Mugabe's time, but as we sit now, we're able to get equal numbers from both parties to listen to what our issues are around desensitization, understanding the current laws, and perhaps where the opportunities lie with regards to LGBTI rights. We are able to table our issues within different communities where members of parliament bring about different communities to discuss developmental issues within their communities. LGBTI persons are being invited to some of these platforms to speak. We have also constantly report on the Universal Periodic Review process. And recently, Zimbabwe came up in January, and we were able to put our pros and lobby for different partners to present our case in terms of protection of LGBTI rights. And Zimbabwe, of course, did respond that they continue to respect what's in the constitution and that they will not change any laws at the moment. But 2 weeks back, when they also came to report on their final response, they accepted 2 recommendations from us, from us meaning LGBTI community. And the 2 recommendations that they accepted, the first one was to protect minors who are intersex from surgeries. And the second one was to protect women, young women and girls, and all persons from violence on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. That shows some progress from our end. But of course, we continue to use the HIV platforms where we continue to engage the UN agencies, our ministry, our National AIDS Councils, but also making sure that we are participating within the regional platforms and global platforms where queer movements are fighting for recognition. We also continue to push our information and also support for our members who would also attend, for instance, the African Commission on Human People's Rights. So those are some of the platforms that we are currently using to change the discourse in Zimbabwe.
Okay, thank you, Samuel. Have you formed any alliances with other human rights movements that are operating in Zimbabwe and outside Zimbabwe?
Yes, we have. Currently, GALZ is part of the NGO Forum, which is a consortium of 21 organizations in Zimbabwe that are dealing with human rights issues. And we speak as a collective with regards to the situation in Zimbabwe and human rights issues. They address various issues, whether you are looking at economic, social, social services, and so on. We are part of that. So we are also part of the collective, and our director also sits on the board. We also work closely with organizations like Crisis Coalition as a member, who are also looking at issues of rule of law and democracy. We are also part of the in the regions. We are also part of Global Interfaith Network that we constantly also speak around issues of faith. We were part, of course, of African Men for Sexual Health and Rights, which has also collapsed. But we also are part of Coalition of African Lesbians. We also work closely with Gender Dynamics and other organizations globally. We were also part of PI-ILGA. We are also part of ILGA International. We work also closely with Outright International, Frontline AIDS, are also part of our partners that we continuously work with. We're also part of it used to be called Global MSM Coalition. Now it's called Impact, which is a coalition of international gay and bisexual men coalition. So yes, we do have alliances and coalitions that we've formed in country and out of country.
Okay, thank you, Samuel. I have another question. The Black community is oppressive in many parts of Africa, especially when it comes to sexuality. If you are of a different sexual orientation, you are demonized. Do you think it's time we educate children from an early age about acceptance? Because changing attitudes that are filled with hate is much of a challenge. So I want to hear from you if maybe educating children about sexual orientation, about sexual rights at a tender age, will help solve some of misplaced attitudes that are filled with hate.
Well, comprehensive sexuality education is critical. I was once young and a child struggling with sexuality issues. I had no one to talk to. So it was a struggle growing as a child who is different, because in my family and many African families, we don't talk about sex. We don't talk about your physical growth when I'm having wet dreams, or what happens when I'm developing a deep voice, what happens when I'm growing a beard. My father never taught me that. A lot of that I learned it from others. And with the world where we are sitting now in the global world, and how much children know and understand about sexuality issues, you find that parents are actually behind, because our children are exposed to various tools of technology where they are able to access information. Secondly, children are quite open-minded and watch different programs on our TVs and radios where they've got to appreciate and understand that LGBTI persons exist. I've been asked by my nephews, my nieces, my neighbors' kids, "Uncle, are you gay? Is that why you are not married?" And I'm like, "Oops, how did you know that?" "Well, I've watched this character on the TV. He was dating with this, you know, we are always with Uncle James or Uncle Peter." So our children continue to perhaps consume information that might not be right for them, because we are not taking responsibility to actually give the right content at the right age. So issues around diversity should be put into as part of comprehensive sexuality education for children. I used to be a high school teacher myself. And when I was teaching before I joined GALZ, I had been teaching for over 5 years in a high school. I would encounter kids that are struggling with a lot of issues about their sexuality, not just being gay. Some were complaining about their breasts or their anatomy, which they didn't think was correct and because teachers are not equipped to be able to do so, they have a dilemma. That's why we continue to see young people of a different sexual orientation, even if they don't know what it is, they are teased, they are bullied in the playground, and the kids get away with it because no one is taught how to embrace diversity. I am sure over the years we've seen partners in the education system developing content that is geared for young people that they can consume at an appropriate age. We've also seen discourses around the age of consent, for instance, for young people within the health sector. And it shows that young people are having their first sexual encounter, young women and girls, at an age of 9 or 10 years. And by the time they get to 12 or they are going to high school, they're either HIV positives or they are mothers. That's why you find our countries have introduced child marriage bills to protect children, to stop child marriages. So we need to be responsive to the global discourse by developing appropriate information for our children, and so that they gain the positive and important information than to consume what they are getting on their own on different social media platforms, which might not be true or which might not be good for them. So as parents, that's something we need to proactively do. So in a way, I say, yes, we should be.
Okay, thanks, Samuel. And now let's talk, I think it's the last question. Let's talk about religion. If queer movements in Zimbabwe, have they made any form of engagement with churches? I mean, I know, many Christians are at the forefront, of sort of using the doctrine of Christianity to sort of castigate homosexuality. So what's your position as GALZ in terms of engaging with religious leaders in, I know, Makandiwa and others in terms of consolidating queer rights in Zimbabwe?
Well, that's it. That has been the most difficult space to actually engage, because in Zimbabwe, what I find interesting is that church does not have power in politics to start with, but it has a big social influence. And which is different when you look at, for instance, compare to Uganda, where religion is really something that perhaps even sometimes overshadowed the politics. But what I've also experienced is that old traditional churches are more inclusive and tolerant compared to the now, what do we call this, Pentecostal churches, churches that are now preaching of healing and visions and of today. Because one of the things that we have noted is that, interestingly enough, we've had people that have conversed on different platforms of those religious leaders that we have attested to say we're able to cure somebody of their sexuality. And you find these postings on their websites. And when I look at the person that has been told to have been turned into being straight, which we call conversion therapy, the very person is sitting next to me say, can you find a man for me? Because there is all this pressure by family for someone to confirm, and in a way where poverty is rooted, which is in our country because of the economy, sometimes we become gullible to the reality. So we've experienced a lot of negativity from those types of churches and not interested in engaging in the conversations. But what I also find interesting is that the very people who are the helpers and close to some of the pastors are part of the community who are actually out and serving in those churches. So we have that dichotomy. And then we also have traditional churches where, for instance, who have said, we are welcome in our church, and yes, we can talk about it, but they don't want to publicly speak about it. Then we have religious leaders that have also come to our conversations the same way we are doing with parliamentarians, and indicating that, they are also affirming verses among certain Christian groups that also speaks about inclusivity of LGBTI persons. And we ride on that and hold on to that, and we are welcome to their churches. But we also have some that says, look, you will not come to my church, and this is my position. So we have a very diluted religious groupings around these issues. Then, of course, we've also had exciting news sometimes that goes back and forth with the Pope around the Catholics, which is where what my religion is, where sometimes you get a very positive response and then you get a negative. But at the country level, you find that sometimes they are quite open for you to be part of the church and not as discriminatory as others. Then we also have traditional churches. We should not leave them out. Our African traditional religious leaders, those are also there. They've also explained to us the different ways that they've also dealt with these issues in their own practices, where, of course, there's an issue of you washing with water and cleansing yourself with the herbs and so on. Some would say, yes, this one will be cured, the other will not be cured, and so forth and so forth. And there are some that have said, look, these are the realities of our communities, and they've always been there. As much as we have tried to give motives, we can't change some of these spirits. So religion has been one of the difficult spaces for us to really transform and take root. But of course, someone in the comments says that, they also don't realize that Christianity is also foreign, which in a way creates a whole lot of tension, because when Zimbabweans speak about this is an African, this is not Zimbabwean, a lot of people are angered at this discourse post-colonization, or during colonization, they don't really delve into reading and finding more information before colonialism to be able to understand what our life was like. So we have a diverse of positions on this issue. And I think for me, I just want to say, politicians are even better to engage compared to religious leaders when it comes to these issues in Zimbabwe. Because at the end of the day, they are the custodians of communities, and our communities who have been fed homophobia for the last 30 years, it will take time to actually unbundle that way or unlearn some of that thinking, which came through the anti-gay campaign that I've spoken about. It has taken root. We still see those reminiscences of Mugabe's legacy in the homophobia that we see in other spaces. But it's a space that we hope will continue to transform bit by bit.
Thank you so much, Samuel. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask one more question and then we round up? If there's no one, then thank you, Samuel. There is a question. Let me see. Oh, it's just a comment from. Okay, church has a big social impact. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining us. Maitabas, we've learned a lot. Myself, I'm a Zimbabwean, and I was not aware of other issues. Like it existed in our community, pre-colonial times, and Shekumombe, like people would do those sexual acts whilst heading cattle and so forth. I would like to follow more on your work at GALZ. I tried typing in your link. I think it was broken, or I typed the wrong website address. If you can just send it in the chat box, and then
it's fine, I can do that.
Yes. I don't know, do you have any pieces that you've written, any forms of text that we can circulate, that we can share at our center, we can put in our notice boards, and we can enlighten some of, I know most Zimbabweans, they are very, very unchanging when it comes to, homosexuality and gay rights, and they don't want to associate with that. I've seen here, they don't want to be found in those spaces. And I did circulate this, webinar, and they were like, no, we can't be part of it. And so the attitude is, they're still battling with these traditional beliefs. And I wish they'd attended so that they can hear from themselves that these things have been with us ever since the pre-colonial times. So thank you so much. Tatenda Zvikuru Siyabonga. I don't know, Andres, if you've got any closing remarks. Thank you for your time, Sam.
You're welcome.
Yeah, no. But from my side, it's just to say thank you very much, Sam. I mean, it was quite insightful, and also, to learn about, the changes that are happening. I do understand that change doesn't fully happen, at once, but then we are moving towards something great, if I may say so. So once again, thank you very much for making time. And as Dan has said, if there's work that you have done, it will be really interesting to learn about it and also circulate it. We really appreciate the time that you took to come present and educate us. Thank you.
You're most welcome. I'll send you something that you can share from the talks that I've done today. And thanks for having me. We'll continue to push. I think one of the most difficult things about Zimbabwe is that we have a culture of silence. And fear is because sometimes when people come to these platforms, they also start questioning their own sexuality because they've not been allowed to interrogate it Because
Yes.
Mugabe would say we can't speak about homosexuality because we are not gays.
Yes, I will tell you a story. You know, Munatsi Shoko, the guy who
Yes.
referred. When he was presenting, people just said, maybe yourself, you are gay. Maybe if I attend this seminar, people will say that, you know, I'm gay and
yes.
They sort of start questioning themselves. So it's very true what you're saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, I'll keep in touch. I have your number, Samuel. I'll keep in touch. I would like to learn more about, you know, queer rights in Zim. We've been kept in the dark for too long. It's very good to hear that at least politicians are giving you that platform to engage with them and see how they can create an inclusive society that everyone feels free, respected, and humanized.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll keep in touch.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, keep safe.
Bye, everyone. Cheers.